Hello and welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. Today we've got a really practical session for you. We're going to do plant propagating.
Oh my goodness, and I'm so excited. Hello, welcome to our channel. We post every week, so do subscribe to follow our continuing adventures. I am very excited because I'm an amateur cutting steeler and propagator.
Yes, you shouldn't mention steel.
No, ask nicely.
Yes.
It often ends in tears, so I'm very excited by this. Okay, Mr. Ryan, this is your profession.
Exactly.
I mean, part of what you do is to propagate rare things. So we are going to learn from the master, ladies and gentlemen.
The first thing you need to do is be organised. You have to have, sorry,
I'm leaving now.
Yeah, I'm going to start from the very basics. You need to have everything in front of you because the first thing you need to know about taking cuttings from things is the fact that the plant needs to be nice and fresh and you need to deal with it promptly.
Yeah.
So there's no sort of sticking it away for a week and then taking the cuttings out and putting them in. You can keep cuttings going though if you put them in a plastic bag for about 24 hours.
This has been my downfall as well, and the trick I learned was to always have a Ziploc bag in your bag or about your person, so that you can put things in a Ziploc bag. If you know you're going to someone's garden and they say, help yourself,
as they will,
keep them fresh. Is that what you would recommend?
Well, I take huge big garbage bags when I go out and get cuttings, I have to say.
You're ruthless.
Yeah, no, it's also because I'm commercial. Everything is sealed in a plastic bag. I always make sure there's just a tiny bit of moisture in there just to keep them fresh, and you can keep them overnight and so forth. But if the cuttings are just over there and you want to put them in, make sure you do it as quickly and promptly as possible to get the whole thing working well. So you need to be organised.
So fresh is best.
So we've got some cuttings here we're going to prepare in a minute, and the other things you need though.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes.
Now, it is early autumn in Australia. Obviously seasonality is going to affect what you're propagating or what you can take cuttings from.
Yeah, at this time of the year you'd be taking semi-hardwood to hardwood cuttings. It would be mainly evergreen things at this time of the year. Deciduous plants I either do from hardwood cuttings in the winter when they're dormant.
Really?
Easy things to strike like hydrangeas and others.
Which we covered in a video which I will link here.
Or in the spring you would do very softwood cuttings, so you might do things like fuchsias and geraniums and other things with a very softwood. As we get into sort of late summer, autumn, then you go into the semi-hardwood things, which are things that are quite firm but not necessarily going into dormancy yet.
I see.
A lot of the things we're going to show you today are general principles that I follow. You'll still have to be experimental. You can't expect anything I show you now that you then go and do promptly immediately with the same plant material. It may or may not work. If it's something different, it obviously is going to take a little bit of a challenge to work out what you have to do.
Right. So there is a hashtag caveat.
Yes.
If you try this at home, it might fail.
I fail with cuttings every year. Yeah, there's certain things.
That's reassuring.
There's certain things that I will strike this year perfectly well. And the other thing I'll mention at this point, because it's actually quite a good idea, keep an exercise book with all your details in it of what you've done. Because a very famous person once said, if you keep doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome, then you're likely to be disappointed.
I quote that often, whoever it was.
But they were right. So if you keep a notebook, I just keep an ordinary exercise book and I line it up and I have the name of the plant down the left-hand side. I then have how many cuttings I put in, how many cuttings I took out, so that you know how many you struck. I have a column that says whether I used a hormonal treatment or not on the plant. And then I have a comments column so that if I take my cuttings out and they've all rotted, I might say, all rotted. But I give my...
loser.
Yeah, I'm a loser. No, I don't say that. What I normally say is they rotted, might have been too soft, try later next year. So you start giving yourself some heads up. So I've got this exercise book, which I can't find. I was going to have sitting here on the table this morning, and I don't know what I've done with it, but it dates back to the 1980s. And I write down anything that's really easy and I've done so often before that it doesn't matter anymore. I don't worry about. But if it's something new I'm propagating, then I make sure it goes in the exercise book, but I don't put it in the exercise book until I take it out as a struck cutting. And so in the meantime, you need other things.
Okay, so let's look at all the equipment.
Now we need potentially some hormonal treatment. And I've got a liquid one here, which is called Clonex for some reason or another.
Does it really matter? Are they all pretty much of a muchness?
Depends on what you're propagating. Most things I actually propagate without a hormonal treatment, I have to say.
Right.
The vast majority of things over the years I found I don't need to. I use a liquid one like this if I've got something that has resinous sap that's inclined to bleed, because it helps seal. the base of the cutting. So I would use a liquid one for things like conifers. Because they have a very resinous sap. Now, this one's actually a gel and you just dip your cuttings in, but a lot of the liquid ones are actually ones that you dilute in water, and I've got one sort of vaguely prepared earlier, and I would normally sit my cuttings in that for half an hour to an hour.
Okay, and what's the diluting?
All of the different liquid ones will have their dilution rates on the bottle. The one I've been using, it was just, believe it or not, a capful into a glass of water. Now there's also powder ones, and here I've got one that's called Rutex P, and it's an Indolebutyric acid. Ooh. Now when you use an Indolebutyric acid, you've got this bag full of powder. If you keep dipping your cuttings in there, you're going to get muck in there. So I decant. So I've just got a little sort of pill jar thing here. So I decant some into that. So if I get it mucky, it doesn't matter.
I did wonder if this was Xanax or something, that it makes you very anxious.
Oh, there's one more thing you need to know about powder hormone treatments, and that is they have an expiry date. So there is no...
This as well?
Not so much. That should be all right, I think. But the Indolebutyric acid in talc, it normally lasts for about 18 months, 2 years after you purchase it. And it should have an expiry date on the side. Make sure you check out use by dates, especially when you're buying it, because if it's been sitting on the shelf for ages, you might actually buy something that's already out of date.
Good point. So here's a question then. In what instance would you use either or?
If I felt I needed a reasonably strong hormonal powder for general cuttings, I would use this. And as I said before, for anything that bleeds, resinous sort of saps, I would definitely use that.
What about the urban myth you can use honey?
Well, you can only use honey if it's completely unprocessed. So processed honey is a pointless exercise because in fact it will do nothing. And I don't normally use honey because it's just so damn messy. The next important thing is a reasonably clean plastic pot. If it's dirty, make sure you've washed it first.
Do you religiously wash all of your used pots before you reuse them?
No.
Do you, Stephen?
No. But I will wash pots I'm going to use for propagating.
Okay.
But if I'm just potting on plants, no.
But isn't it more about potential fungus, bacteria?
Yeah. I grow hundreds of thousands of plants a year. I can't ever pin down the loss of a plant to a dirty pot. So I am not worried about dirty pots.
I'm going to run with that. That's like a teenage boy not having to clean his room. Nope, Stephen said.
But I will clean my pots if I'm going to do cuttings, because cleanliness is very important when you're actually doing the propagating side of things, because you've got to remember you're working with a very fragile baby. And so you do need to be very careful. The material in the pot. Now, if you can get sharp washed sand, and aquarium sand will actually work. You can also buy propagating sand from some of the big barns and what have you. Fine. But I tend to use a product called perlite, which is a gypsum that's been through a very big furnace and it blows it up into little sort of squishable granules. It has a higher base temperature, so it doesn't need so much warming up to warm your cuttings up. It also is porous, so it holds a little bit of moisture, and because it's something that you could actually crush, the roots will often grow through it, particularly if they're fine roots, so they come out with a little bob of it when you take your cuttings out. So the perlite is good. I would use clean perlite every time I propagate, so I wouldn't reuse the same perlite, but I would reuse that perlite in my potting mixes. So I wouldn't waste it, but I certainly wouldn't reuse it for more cuttings.
So is this what we're going to pot into?
Yes.
100% perlite?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, there you go. I used to use some peat, so I used to do a perlite peat mixture. I don't anymore. It seems to make no difference. I used to use sand and peat before I got onto perlite, and it seemed to help with cuttings then. But I've tried with perlite and peat, and it seems to make no difference. So I just use straight perlite, and I don't use too coarser grade. So the sort of horticultural grade, I think they call this. So you've got that. Then you need some plastic labels. And it's really important that you write all your details on the plastic label.
Including the dates.
I'm the worst speller on earth unless it's in Latin. And so then we put the date down. The other thing we put down is if we're using a hormonal treatment, what one we're using. So that goes on the label. Let's say, for instance sake, we're doing the liquid one because we're going to do a conifer. And then I will say whether I'm putting the cuttings outdoors in the shade house or whether they're going into my propagator. My propagator is a fogger, so I would put them in the fogger. So I'll just put fog on there to remind me where I put the cuttings in. And once I've done the cuttings, I will then put on the label how many I prepared. So that when I take the cuttings out, I can then know exactly how many struck. So I can get my percentages of strike so that I can adjust if needs be. And all that information will then go into my exercise book when I take the cuttings out
Where you
and
can
pot them
find
on. You need a good marking pencil as well. I have tried every indelible ink pen in the world and they all fade off. You can use a Chinograph pencil or this one, which I like because you can in fact write reasonably small with it. The Chinographs tend to write really, really big. And this is made by Stabilo and it's called an aquarellable.
All right, now we have got all our powders, we've got the pot. What else do we need?
All right, so we need a few other things.
Yes.
One of the most important pieces of equipment is a dibber.
Can I just say that I have a dibber, ladies and gentlemen, and I think it's one of my favourite things on earth.
It is. I mean, you can use an old biro or whatever.
But who would? The glamour of this object.
Yes, this is a stainless steel dibber made in Holland. It is just gorgeous.
Yeah.
And you can use it for pricking out seedlings and you can use it for dibbing your cuttings in and it stays nice and clean and it's gorgeous. And I also find it very useful for weeding under succulents and cacti and things. I can get in underneath where you wouldn't ordinarily do. We need a sharp blade. Now I use one of these box cutters.
What are we going to be using that for?
For preparing the cuttings.
Okay.
And a pair of scissors, which I'll show you why I need those in a minute as well. So they're all the things apart from, and we do need a container for the liquid hormone if we're going to stand our cuttings in it. I thought we might start with the conifer, only because it's the closest to me, and also it's got a few slight variants that you need to know about as opposed to things that are broadleaf plants.
Okay. So firstly, what species is this?
Well, this is a Chamaecyparis nootkatensis pendula.
Oh my goodness.
Weeping
Pendula I'm getting.
Yes. Well, it comes from Nootka in Canada, so hence Nootkatensis. And it's a Chamaecyparis, which makes it a false cypress. And
this one here.
No, it's the one over there. Now, conifers are interesting because when you're doing cuttings, you've got to understand the meristematic tissue of the cutting.
Meristematic?
Yeah. Now, meristematic tissue is found in 3 places in a piece of wood.
Now, hang on. What is meristematic?
It's the growth tissue.
Ah, right.
Growth tissue is found at the tips because that's where growing comes from.
Yeah.
It's also found at the nodes, which is where leaves and other stems join the main stem. And it's also found under the bark in the cambium layer. So you've got 3 forms of meristematic tissue and you sort of need to know where they are so that you do the appropriate things for the cutting.
Okay.
All right. Now,
I don't know about you, but I'm already getting anxious.
it's not that hard once you understand it. So generally speaking, cuttings I do in most cases would be around about hand span lengthwise. That's what I tend to work on with most plants. Some things are so minute it's ridiculous and you've got to do tiny cuttings, but you've got to sort of work on what you've got. Now, if I was to pull these, because obviously I've got to bare the stem so that I can then put it down into my propagating mixture, I end up pulling great chunks of bark out.
You get a tear.
Yeah, so you get a tear. The tear is fine if that's what I want to use as the cutting, but I'm using that. So I don't want to tear all the way up the trunk. So what I then do is I get my knife and I nick. Now I nick upwards and outwards. The reason being, of course, that way I'm not going to damage the stem. But it takes a little bit of getting used to because you're likely to take the top off some of your cuttings on a regular basis and possibly your finger. All right, so I've got that prepared there. Now, this is where your meristematic tissue comes in rather importantly at the node. Now, where I've taken one off...
Then, will every node have that tissue?
Yes.
So every node is capable of regeneration?
And that is why I would put this into a liquid hormone treatment because you will then put it into the liquid above the last cut you made on the stem and potentially all of those nicks you've made could root.
Right.
The more roots you get, the better the plant, obviously. Now, the other thing you need to know is I will then go behind where I nicked one of those stems off.
Okay.
And with my thumb on the opposite side of the stem, I will slice downwards and through.
Oh, I see.
Now, what I've done there is I've also exposed a whole pile more of the meristematic tissue. So I've opened a wound that once it's soaking in my liquid hormone treatment, that whole area there will then become part of the root system area.
Okay, so a question then. This process, would you use that on most sorts of cuttings, like things like camellias or exactly the same kind of process?
Basically the same process, and I'll show you on a broadleaf plant how I would deal with it later, but I would do the same process. The only proviso is if you've got something with hollow stems, you don't do the downward slice into the stem, because you could be opening up the pith inside, and that will then encourage rot. So I wouldn't do that with, say, hydrangeas, because they're pithy inside.
So you cut that straight off?
Well, not straight off. You'd still do a sloping cut, because if you're doing it up in the air like I do, if you don't do a sloping cut, you can't actually cut. And by pulling through on an angle, you can actually cut the stem. If you try and pull through on a straight line, you can't. You'll break it. And you do need to have a nice clean cut. Always make sure you've got a nice sharp blade. And you will nick the top of your thumb regularly until you get used to doing this.
Price you pay.
Yeah, hopefully you won't be drawing too much blood. But it's really just a matter of getting used to not moving your thumb. You're using that as actually something to guide your cutting. So you're actually pulling your cutting through the blade. You're not pulling the blade through the cutting. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Because if you do it on the bench, you're going to bruise the back of the cutting.
Which is what I've done.
Yeah, so if you can get used to doing this, I would get something quite soft and sappy and practice on that first before you start on anything really hard and woody.
And so to potting, you are making a little hole with a magic dibber and potting them around the edge to maximise space.
See, there's a nice hole there. All right, now we've done conifers. Funnily enough, there's a few tricks when you're growing broadleaf plants that are different. So we need to discuss those as well. And here we have some pieces off a dogwood that I cut earlier.
Beautiful.
And there's a couple of things to know about these. One is, if you've got something that's got flower buds in it, make sure you remove all flower buds or flowers. Again, you've got to expose the nodes. Now, some things you can pull a leaf off and it will pull cleanly. If it pulls cleanly, then there's no need to cut them. But if it pulls and rips a piece down, then you need to do the same I did with the conifer, all right? In this case, it seems to be clean, so I can pull them down. And then I get my knife behind one bud on one side, and I slice down like so, and then through like I did with the conifers.
So same action.
Same action. And then I take the top off like so. And because the leaves are really big, I do that. That's what the scissors were for. So that is a prepared cutting. Now with these, I might well put them in the powder one. I like to prepare, dip them and put them in straight away. If you stand them in water or something and get a whole batch of them together and you put it in here, you end up with something a little like lumpy porridge. You'll get enough on the stem to coat the base of the stem without wetting it. And then you don't muck up your hormone treatment as well. And then I do basically exactly the same as I did with the conifers.
Around the edge?
Around the edge. And I would put them down so that they're only just clear of the potting mix.
And how many? You've got one node?
One node is generally long enough. And as I said, you go behind one like that, cut down like that.
Excellent.
Remove the top half of the leaf and dibber it into place, trying not to have the leaves overhanging each other too much.
I've always wanted to know why you cut the leaves, and that's just to conserve the energy.
It is, and it means they're not overhanging each other, so that if you've got a system whereby they're getting watered either by a mist spray system or a fogger system, then you're not leaving dry patches of leaves underneath other leaves. So the moisture can get all the way around.
All right, let's go to the fogger. I'll take these.
And I'll take those, and away we go. Come this way, Mr. Lucas.
Ah, Mr. Ryan, I feel like I'm entering a magic world.
Well, you're certainly entering a world that is somewhat off limits to the average person in the public.
Oh my goodness, hallowed ground.
Here we have my plant humidity crib.
And can I just say, it feels really balmy and gorgeous in here.
It is. It's much warmer in here than it is outside.
It's like a day spa. Okay, let's have a look.
Right.
All right, I'm ready for the secret to be revealed. Is this the secret to your success?
It is part of the secret of one's success. When one has the proper professional equipment, it makes all the difference in the world.
Okay.
And this is my amazing fogger. So this is a fogging machine that keeps the humidity at 100% the whole time. It also has a heating element underneath it, which gives a little bit of warmth. You possibly can feel that if you really try. It's just to take the chill off. And my cuttings will sit in there until such time as they are struck.
So, Mr. Ryan, how long would things spend in your humidity crib?
It really does depend on the variety of the plant. I have got cuttings in here that have been here for nearly 12 months. Really difficult to strike things. Other things can go in there for weeks.
But it will stay alive for 12 months and it won't rot?
Well, look, for instance sake, here we have some Oricaria cuttings that I put in earlier. And they were put in on the 1st of the 3rd, 20.
A year ago?
A year ago. And if I take one out,
not a root.
Not a root yet. So there you go. So they might sit there for months yet, but they can stay alive for that period of time. Eventually you give up because of course you can't keep them there forever.
Oh my God.
But
that
yes,
is amazing.
I have had cuttings well over 12 months old that have struck. But having said that, now here we have something that is actually showing a root coming out the bottom of the pot.
Yeah, and what is that?
This is actually the thing we did a profile on some time ago, the Iochroma, one of our first profiles, which is now called a Tazzellia. Those cuttings were put in on the 8th of the 2nd. So the 8th of February this year. And that's got roots coming out the bottom of the pot.
So hang on, that is just over a month.
Yeah.
Wow, that's quick.
Yeah.
And they look, is this new growth?
Yeah, that's all new growth. When I put the cuttings in, they only had the bits at the bottom on them. All of that is new growth.
So we can see that they look like little plantlets.
Yeah, they are, in fact, little plantlets. And when I pot them up separately, which I'll do next cool day I've got, I find if I take them out of the humidity crib, on a warm sunny day, they often struggle to re-establish. So I tend to pick a nice wet rainy day, and then I'll take the cuttings out, pot them up individually, and then hopefully over the next 24 hours or so they'll be fine.
I'm amazed that you've got your 12-month, nearly 13-month cuttings going nowhere slowly, and a month and you've got functioning plants.
Well, that's what I was meaning. The fact is you've just got to keep tabs on them, work out what's going and what's not going, and of course you don't have to tell anybody if something didn't work. It's in your book and it's just yours to keep.
This is just between us, your failures.
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
For the home gardener, such as myself, now what I have done to achieve this is just use a Ziploc bag with the cutting in its pot. I do use potting mix, so I'm now going to switch to perlite.
I think you'd be better with most things with perlite.
With my Ziploc bags, I just use a mister, like a hand mister, and I mist it, and that stays quite moist for weeks sometimes without having to replenish it. So the $1 million question is, I have had patchy success, and I think the reason is that I'm worried that they're going to rot, and so I take them out too quickly.
Yeah, you need to leave them in there until they've actually got defined root systems underneath them.
And you can only see that if they're coming out the bottom.
Yeah, and generally you don't want to keep pulling them out to check. And I know of people who've done that, and they always pull out the same cutting, and that one of course never roots because they keep pulling it out. It's better if you've got them in a pot that's appropriate size-wise, so that when they do start to get roots, they do get the old one pops out the bottom, and then you know something's ready to be moved on.
Well, that was fantastic. I feel like I've learned the secrets of propagation.
Some of them. I'm probably holding back a little.
Oh, as you should, as you should. It's your profession.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I've learned a huge amount, and I'm sure everyone else is, and I'm sure people are going to have a million questions, so do feel free to put them below. Stephen will get to them if we can, and if you can answer them.
Yeah, well, if I can, yes.
You know, the meaning of life might be beyond you. But thank you very much for watching. As we said, we post every week, so do subscribe if you want to hear more from us.
Hopefully we'll see you all next week, and we'll be doing something else important, I'm sure.
Can't wait. Thank you, Mr. Ryan. Thanks for watching.
Bye all.